Welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. We're so happy that you could join us today. My name is Andy Erickson. I work here at St. Anthony Falls Lab. It's my honor to co-host this seminar series event through St. Anthony Falls Lab, but in partnership with the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. We're so excited to have this event today where we're going to feature some case studies. I'm going to hand off the microphone now to Linnea, who's going to take over the rest of the program. I hope you enjoy the seminar.
Thanks, Andy. My name is Linnea Savereide. I'm an engineer at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and part of the climate grant team. I'm here today with Paula Kalinosky, who is an engineer, a hydrologist, and the Minnesota Stormwater Manual Coordinator at the MPCA. The projects we're going to hear about today were funded by the MPCA planning grants for stormwater, wastewater, and community resilience, fiscal year 2022. The objective of the grant program is to provide an opportunity for communities to assess vulnerabilities and begin planning for the effects of Minnesota's changing climate. Heavy rains are now more common in Minnesota and more intense than at any time on record, which presents new stormwater management challenges. There's been a lot of interest in addressing these challenges and a lot of questions about what resilient planning can look like. So today we're taking a closer look at 3 projects from the first round of funding. Approximately $870,000 was given to 12 projects across the state. We don't have time for all 12, so we tried to feature a representative cross-section of the stormwater-focused projects with different scopes and in different locations throughout Minnesota. As you listen to these presentations, keep in mind there will be another round of grant funding soon. Planning grants very soon, and at some point, stormwater implementation grants, specifically for resilient infrastructure. If you'd like updates about these, there should be links in the chats to our website and an email list that you can sign up for. The MPCA would also like to acknowledge the many other organizations at local, state, and national levels, both public and private, that provide resources or funding to support resiliency planning. Moving on to our first presentation, let me introduce Ian Weber and Trent Imdieke. Ian is a project engineer for the City of St. Cloud. He's a professional engineer with over 10 years of experience in project management, design, and construction. He has direct experience in the preparation of long-term infrastructure planning, such as the city's capital improvement program and the development of numerous stormwater management plans and feasibility studies for private, local, and federal agencies. Trent is a water resources engineer at SEH. He's a professional engineer with extensive experience working with the City of St. Cloud in the application, planning, and implementation of grant projects. Trent has assisted St. Cloud and other central Minnesota clients with the implementation of over $1 million worth of projects funded through the Clean Water Fund. His project experience includes urban drainage design, hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, and comprehensive watershed planning. Ian and Trent worked on the Pantown neighborhood Watershed Stormwater Resilience and Flood Mitigation Plan in the City of St. Cloud, which we're about to hear about. Welcome, Ian and Trent. Thanks for speaking today.
Right. Thanks, Linnea. As mentioned, I'm Ian Weber. I'm a City of St. Cloud project engineer, and I'm joined here by Trent Imdieke, water resource engineer with SEH. We're here today to talk about the Pantown Neighborhood Stormwater Resilience and Flood Mitigation Plan. Major push to separate the wastewater and stormwater systems. All of the stormwater piping routes to a single 96-inch diameter outfall to the Sauk River, right around where you're seeing a little red dot there on the screen. Within the district, there are several locations of localized flooding, and I believe that's what those green X's are, and as shown in the images in the So our objective for the project was first to identify what is the primary cause of flooding within the watershed. Then, if we cannot develop a solution to that primary cause, to develop individual solutions to the localized flooding that we were observing. Within those solutions, we also wanted to incorporate the more intense rainfalls that we're seeing within Minnesota. And then with the plan completed, build public support and to position the city to pursue new funding opportunities, maybe the implementation grants that Linnea was talking about. So our process was first, before even the grant was approved or applied for, the city developed an inventory of stormwater flooding issues. Whenever we'd get a call, city staff would put this into our GIS database. When we saw the opportunity for this application, we analyzed that database and noticed there was a cluster of flood events within the Pantown neighborhood, primarily in the location of Veterans Drive and at the intersection of 7th and 25th. So concluding that that should be our primary flood mitigation area within the city, we moved on to developing a work plan and applying for the grant. With it being approved, we moved on to our first round of public engagement. So that included was issuing 2,500 postcard mailings to all of the individual homeowners within the Watershed District, asking for any stormwater concerns they have for their neighborhood. And what resulted from that is we identified another high priority flood site at the intersection of 27th Avenue and 1st Street. From there, we worked with SEH to develop the model inputs that included as-built, GIS, and survey information obtained by the city. And then moved on to the model development, as Trent will touch on shortly. Throughout the process, we engaged the public several times, including the postcard mailings that I already talked about, and also visiting on site at the location where flooding was occurring. I think that was valuable just to get an idea of what their experiences of the flood events were, including estimated depths. And in one case, they even passed along recordings of the flooding, which helped us calibrate the model. Trent will touch on model calibration, the mitigation strategies that were developed, but to conclude the public engagement, after the project was complete, we have had follow-up meetings with the individual property owners and sent another set of postcard mailings detailing the results of the study and asking for feedback.
All right. Thanks, Ian. Sound okay? All right. All right, so getting into the modeling here. Started with our existing conditions model. So we used XP-Swim, an XP-Swim 2D model to model the Pantown watershed. And one of the really great things about XP-Swim, specifically the 2D models, is it gives you these super user-friendly existing conditions, or these super friendly flood inundation maps like the one you see here. This is for an existing conditions model, and all these colorful areas correspond to areas where where the model is showing flooding, surface flooding, and the color gradient reflecting the relative depths. So it's just a really user-friendly way and understandable way for especially non-technical people to see the results and understand it without having to look at a bunch of numbers in a table. Next thing we did, once we got our existing conditions model up and running, is we calibrated the model. So this process involves modeling a historic storm. So for example, maybe there was a 5-inch rain on May 1st of 2020. We can recreate that storm in XP-Swim and then take a inundation map like this one and share it with city staff and residents and get their feedback and say, hey, does this look like about what you were seeing during that storm? Does it match fairly well? And if it doesn't, we know that we got to come back to our model and tweak some variables to get it to match better. And it just really helps to make sure that our model results actually reflect real world conditions. Next, we moved into our projected conditions model. So this is where we took the climate change data and applied it to our existing conditions model to see where future problems might pop up. And then finally, we developed a list of proposed alternatives to consider and apply to the model, and a list of concepts that may alleviate flooding. So Ian kind of alluded to it. There's the one major watershed that, or major trunk line through the center of the neighborhood here. And our existing conditions model quickly confirmed what we all suspected, that that thing was severely undersized. So the obvious solution is to upsize that thing. And turns out that's not the most feasible thing when you're talking about almost 5 miles of pipe, fairly large diameter pipe. The cost for that was just astronomical. So we knew we had to start looking at other options that didn't involve just upsizing a bunch of 8-foot diameter pipe. So we developed a list here. This just includes some of the concepts that we came up with. Ultimately, I think we ended up with over 14 concepts. So prioritization became very important. I'll touch on that in a moment here, but we kind of just kept everything on the table because it's a difficult watershed, being that it's entirely developed like this. And so it meant that we didn't have a lot of room for surface storage, and being that it's developed, it's not super easy to tear up pipe and replace a bunch of pipe when you've got to reconstruct a bunch of roadway and all sorts of other infrastructure. So here's an example of one of our proposed concept results here. So for this concept, we split flow off this collector line right here and sent it to the west to the MnDOT right of way here, which we believe to have capacity. And like I mentioned, for the existing conditions results, this is just super user friendly here to see and understand the results of this concept here. So the yellow being the existing 10-year flood, and the blues and greens being the proposed 10-year flooding after we diverted that water to the west there. And just to give you a frame of reference here, I lost my photo, but there's another one back here. A little bit hard to see, but the background photo here, this is what that street looks like in that area during one of our historic events. So street completely underwater and extends quite a ways beyond the picture there. So here we've got another proposed concept result map. I just wanted to highlight this because I really like how the city went about sharing their results. They set up a GIS story map, and the residents anyone can access it online. And what I really like about it is this slider here. As you drag it across the screen, you can see it go from existing to proposed. The yellow being the existing, and you see the surface BMP that was implemented there. And again, I think it's really important and really helpful to make results easily digestible for everybody. All right, so I mentioned we ended up with a ton of concepts here, so prioritization became very important. So with a lot of back and forth between SEH and the city and collaboration, we developed this scoring system here to prioritize which projects we wanted to go after first, which ones are going to give us the most bang for our buck, because St. Cloud, like every city, has a finite money, and they need to know how to spend it best, what's going to yield them the best results. And I will be zooming in on this stuff here. So first off, we had to come up with a cost benefit analysis for each one. So we had to come up with a very high level cost estimate for each one. And ended up with a cost effectiveness score. And then property needs is pretty self-explanatory. Maintenance needs, if it was something that was low maintenance, say just upsizing some storm sewer, that got a point, or got a higher number. If it's low maintenance, got a lower number. Local versus watershed wide improvements, that's another pretty self-explanatory one. Things like the trunk line replacement for the entire watershed, that got a high number for that, but it got low marks on cost effectiveness and the next category, the ease of implementation. The CIP proximity score, that was just if we knew that we could, if the project was near a planned CIP project, it got a couple points because we knew that it'd be a lot easier to implement it if it was near another project and we could pair it with that versus a standalone stormwater project. Water quality got a point, and then is the project with an environmental justice area? If it was, within 2 of the areas, it got 2 points, 1 point. And then history of property damage. And then the critical infrastructure score that took into account obvious things like emergency services routes. Does it protect those routes? But we also considered things like community centers and food shelves, just trying to keep in mind the environmental justice throughout the ranking here. And then the city priority ranking, that only applied to our non-structural practices. And then ultimately we aggregated all those scores with a maximum of 30. And then here is just some of the costs. As I mentioned, the trunk line reconstruct projects had just an astronomical price tag associated with them, but moving into some of the more local projects in our high priority areas become much more manageable, especially if we can combine with another project. And yeah.
So as I alluded to earlier, the next steps in our process is to continue with the communication that we've had with property owners and to other members of the community who have an interest in stormwater. And then to research funding opportunities, as Grant noted, several of these solutions have quite a high price tag, and coming up with a solution that really is going to be a big part of implementing these. We also are looking for our project partners. So in some cases, not all the solutions, but some of them, this might end up being a private-public partnership. In that vein, there is right near the area of Veterans Drive where we were seeing quite a bit of flooding, fairly large property sold recently. And so we've been reaching out to them to coordinate if there's any sort of stormwater BMP we can help place on that site. Yes, lastly, we're just prioritizing the upcoming projects. So if we have a CIP project that happens to also be near to one of the implementation, that might give it a boost in how we rank that within the city projects.
Thank you. And looks like we've got some time for questions. And I just want to make a quick note that all of today's questions, whether they're posted in the chat or you can get them to Andy, the audience members can get them to Andy here today via email. If you're not able to get your question in during the post-presentation discussion or the panel discussion, those will go out to the participants, the seminar participants, and they will provide some brief answers. Those will go back to the registrants in about a week from now. So post your questions. Even if we don't get to them, you'll get an answer. Okay, so we're able to take some questions for Ian and Trent. Let's start with one from the audience if there's one. Okay, I'm going to come over and give you the microphone. And if you could please state your name and affiliation and before you tell us your question, we'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Brian Jastrom from Rockleaf Water Environmental. And you talked about model calibration and talking with city staff about flooding, areas that flooded, and you saw an area that might flood with the model and you kind of talked to them to see if that was true. Are there any other steps for model calibration that you would have liked to have done on this project?
Good question. Honestly, not much. This was kind of a unique project. We normally don't get this much calibration information, but we got a ton of calibration data for this one. We had great photos with reference points where we could gauge the depth, like even things like, we had photos with vehicles stopped in the middle of the road with water halfway up their wheel. Things like that just gave us assume that's, X diameter of a wheel. And right there, you can get a flood depth. We had closed circuit TV, like security video of flooding and inundation there. So really, we were fortunate to have as much calibration data as what we did.
Thank you. Is there a question online? Let's take one from online, and then we'll go back to audience.
First of all, can everybody hear me?
Maybe take one local.
Please give us your name and affiliation.
I'm Camilla Correll with Emmons and Oliver Resources, and I was just curious to hear a little bit more about that calibration data and the photos. Did you get that through those postcard surveys, or how did you get that information?
I think we got some from the postcards, but St. Cloud does a good job of keeping tabs on it and keeping communication open with the residents kind of constantly, like even before and after the project. So Noah from the city has been talking with, there's a certain group of business owners in one of our big problem areas that he's been speaking with for quite a while. And they're the ones that provided the security footage. But yes, postcards, yeah, we definitely got calibration data from the postcards. But yeah, the city already had a pretty substantial library.
Do we have one online or? Okay, let's take one from online.
Okay, how does this sound? Great. The question is, when calibrating the model based on real life observations, which variables did you end up adjusting and why?
So for our specific project, we actually didn't have to adjust too much, but it kind of just happened to work out that way. But had we had more discrepancies, things like runoff coefficients, we could adjust the runoff coefficients a little bit. Time of concentration is a common one that we'll adjust. Trying to think what else here. Runoff coefficient and time of concentration are kind of the big ones. We might also start, we did think about factoring in inlet capacity to see if that was affecting our model. But like I said, we kind of got lucky again in that we didn't require a lot of calibration for this specific model.
We'll take one more from online.
Okay, another question is, how much does this XPSWIMM software cost?
Great question. I don't know offhand, to be honest. I know there's different tiers. They got different tiers based on how many nodes you have in the model, how many structures and subcatchments. I don't think it's particularly cheap.
John Galber is raising his hand, so I better allow him to ask a question.
As long as all the questions are about XP Swim, I have another question about XP Swim.
Great.
So how many events and what size events did you calibrate with? Because calibration, as you know, is a really difficult problem with XP Swim.
Good question. We initially looked at 5 events. We ended up throwing out 2 of the events because data was suspect, or we didn't have good enough pictures to gauge the depths, or for a couple reasons. 2 of them were thrown out. So we ended up with 3 events. But yeah, it is tricky because you can get one model, or you can get your model to seem to be calibrated perfectly to, the May 2020 storm, but then it doesn't really work very well with the October 2016 storm. So you got to kind of find that balance. Ultimately, that's kind of what it was finding a balance between our 3 storms and kind of shooting for that average in there. What conditions matched best with all of them.
Okay, with that, a quick thank you again to Ian and Trent, and we're going to move on to our next presentation. Thanks. Thanks. Okay, presentation number 2 is coming to us from Rochester, Minnesota. It's the title of the project is Resilience Hub Planning Using Flood Risk Assessment in the City of Rochester, Minnesota. Our presenters today are Troy Erickson. Troy is the Water Resources Manager for the City of Rochester. His position is part of the Public Works and Environmental Services Division. He is a professional engineer who had joined the city in 2014 after working as an engineering consultant for approximately 15 years. Troy received his bachelor's and his master's from the University of Minnesota and was privileged to work here at the SAFA Lab as a research assistant under the guidance of Dr. Heinz Steffen. And we have on his team, Camilla Correll, who is a professional engineer from Emmons and Oliver Resources. Camilla is a professional engineer with 26 years of experience, with an emphasis on integrated watershed management and sustainable engineering design. She has extensive experience in the development of watershed management plans, watershed rulemaking, application of low-impact development techniques, and stakeholder facilitation, including large multiple interest group discussions. All right, and with that, thank you for presenting today. Come on up and share your project.
Okay, thank you. All right. So moving forward. So again, I'm Troy Erickson, the Water Resources Manager with the City of Rochester and project manager, client lead for this particular project. And also want to introduce this once again, Camilla Correll, who's really been the visionary for our comprehensive surface water management planning effort. And a lot of thanks go out to her for all the work that's going so far. So today we're here to discuss both the risk assessment that went in to this grant we'll ultimately talk about, along with our climate resilience hub.
And I just wanted to say really quickly, can you hear me?
Yep.
That this has been a team effort. There's been a lot of people involved in the development of the flood risk assessment and the comprehensive surface water management plan. So in addition to our team at EOR, we have a couple people from Perkins and Will involved in the project, as well as freshwater. And then the City of Rochester has invited a bunch of people to participate in the process as well across various departments, including Public Works, Parks and Recreation, Community Development, and Rochester Public Utilities. So, like we heard from the previous conversation, everybody's recognizing that we're having changes related to climate change. So communities are really trying to figure out how best to evaluate the impacts related to climate change. And they're also trying to figure out how to engage their community and to promote an awareness of climate vulnerabilities. What are the expectations of the community as we move forward in these uncertain times? And then how does the city take this information that it collects to prioritize the needs and develop community-based solutions for adaptation strategies? So these are big challenges that communities are facing?
Okay, so I'll provide a general background to this project and its inception. So as I mentioned, the city is currently embarking or in the final stages of developing our comprehensive surface water management plan. And with that comes a lot of opportunities to connect with other departments and projects and different things like that. One of which lends itself very readily was our city sustainability and resiliency community work plan. Obviously, it's a big theme of our surface water management plan. And especially as that particular work plan had 6 focus areas, those being climate change resiliency, city for health, vibrant neighborhoods, accessible transportation, resilient economy, and environmental health. Many of those, there's clear connections with our comprehensive surface water management plan. With that said, we dove a little deeper into that sustainability and resiliency work plan, and with respect to one specific strategy, and that strategy being create a network of resource hubs to increase residents' access and education, respond to community needs. So a clear connection there. With that in mind, we identified this opportunity with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to apply for a grant that would support the planning for that. And that was entitled Resilience Hub Planning Using Flood Risk Assessment in the city of Rochester. So the great thing about this was we were able to augment the work that we were already planning to do from the standpoint of hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, ultimately the risk assessment, and advance another plan, that being the sustainability and resiliency work plan. So it was a win-win and something we're very excited to move forward with. So with that, Camilla will move forward and discuss the risk assessment, flood risk assessment.
Yeah.
If you like.
So if we go to the next slide.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So what do we mean by?
I'll stand back here. Sorry.
What do
We'll get
we-
this figured out.
What do we mean by a flood risk assessment? So risk is the likelihood of something happening times the consequence or the impact of that, in this particular case, flood event. So we're evaluating the likelihood of flooding and then also evaluating the impact of that flooding or inundation to the city's infrastructure, as well as its environmental assets and the communities that are experiencing that flooding. So historically, flood risk assessments have been one-dimensional. They have looked at catastrophic events like a 100-year, 24-hour event and evaluated the impacts mostly in riverine systems. So what was the monetary or the economic cost of a flooding situation? But if we consider the added components of climate change, environmental impacts, and recognition that more vulnerable populations are disproportionately experiencing the effects of climate change, then risk-based management needs to account for more than just that catastrophic event. It needs to look at the range of events and evaluate the types of flooding that we have in our urban communities to see if it's happening on the river or if it's happening at urban flash flooding. So this assessment included rainfall events that may affect, instead of looking at rainfall events that affect more of the community, it's also looking at these smaller events to see what the impacts are to smaller portions of the community that are experiencing more chronic flooding issues like basements. So this is the multi-dimensional approach that the city of Rochester took in conducting its flood risk assessment. And these are the steps that we took. We identified what could be evaluated within each of these 3 components of sustainability. We developed likelihood consequence plots for each component of sustainability. We evaluated the risk per component, and then we prioritized where in the city we needed to look at the types of improvements that are needed to alleviate the flooding. So for the first step, on the next slide, these were the 3 components of sustainability. We looked at infrastructural features like critical facilities, which Trent mentioned in the previous presentation. We were looking at where emergency services and electrical stations are subject to flooding. We also looked at roadway inundation or the length of flooded road. We considered road safety, and we considered emergency routes. For the social component of sustainability, we looked at building inundation, so those buildings that aren't critical facilities. We looked at impacts to drinking water resources, and we looked at social vulnerability. And then finally, under the environmental component, we looked at the sensitivity of wetlands to flooding, the sensitivity of trees, as well as stream bank stability. And the weights that you see here, the 45%, the 45, and the 10, are the overall weights that the city gave to each of these three components of sustainability. So for each of those components of sustainability, we needed to evaluate what the consequence is of flooding when you intersect flooding with those different components. So if we take wetland susceptibility, for example, if it was a highly susceptible wetland, it would get a score of 1. If it's a moderately susceptible wetland, it would get a score of 0.5. And if it was least susceptible, it would get a score of 0. So that way, when you intersect flooding with the resource, then you can assign a particular weight to how susceptible you think it would be to the impact, and then assign a consequence score. So for each of the individual subcomponents, we developed a likelihood consequence plot, which you can see on the lower left-hand corner. And what this shows is likelihood on the bottom. So from the 2 to the 100-year event, for each subcatchment, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you can assign a consequence score for that design event and then assign a risk to it. So the higher risk events are in the upper right-hand corner in red, and the lower consequence scores, or the lower risk ratings, are on the lower left-hand corner in blue. We developed likelihood consequence plots for each of the individual subcomponents, as well as the overall score for the sustainability components. And we did this for existing conditions, so current land use and existing rainfall patterns. We did it for existing and projected rainfall patterns, and then future land use and projected rainfall patterns. So as you can see, this becomes a bunch of data that we're generating through this analysis. We had a total of 240 likelihood and consequence plots. So then what we did is we could evaluate each of the subcomponents individually to see which subcatchments are coming up higher in terms of risk, but then you can aggregate them to show the individual sustainability components. So for example, if we said the one on the right is infrastructure, we had the individual ones, length of road, critical facilities, individually. So we aggregated them by sustainability component. And in the end, you could aggregate it also by all 3 sustainability components to just have 1 score. And then from there, you can plot each of these likelihood consequence plots to show visually which subcatchments are coming up as the highest priority subcatchments. And then the city can use that information to say, does that ring true? Is that where we have seen flooding for, in this case, a 10-year event? So this figure is a lot, but really what we're just showing here is how the weights were assigned at various stages of the process. So on the left, you can see what I showed you in a previous slide. For infrastructural, it got 0.45. For social, it got 0.45. And for environmental, it got 0.10. From there, you can see the subcomponents that I showed you on a previous slide. And then sometimes those subcomponents were broken down even further. So there's a lot of weighting that goes into this process. So it was difficult to visualize the results because we had so many different iterations and we had so many different weights assigned. So we created a tool, a mapping visualization tool using open source software called the Shiny tool. And so for each of the scenarios that we ran, whether that was a design event under existing or projected conditions, whether it was an individual component or the aggregate component, you could toggle back and forth between these different scenarios to see which subcatchments are coming up as the highest priority. So the city could use that tool to say, okay, where are we starting to see multiple impacts affecting the same subwatershed, so they could identify those as the priority subwatersheds for the implementation of projects.
Okay, thank you, Camilla. Yeah, and I'd just like to add to the risk assessment was incredibly important because it provided a way, like I guess, a sustainable way of identifying priorities to projects that ultimately will come into play, and taking into account things like social justice and whatnot. So, oops, the one that all worked out good. In any case, but all right, I'll move on to the next subject here. So, resilience hub. So that fits in that with the flood risk assessment because that provided a, kind of the boundary conditions where are flooding concerns present, and where are potential problems that we can fix through projects and things like that. But again, what is a resilience hub? So when I first entered this, I had that question, but resilience hubs are community serving facilities augmented to support residents, coordinate communication, distribute resources, and reduce carbon pollution while enhancing quality of life. Resilience hubs can meet a myriad of physical and social goals by utilizing a trusted physical space, such as a community center, recreation facility, or multifamily housing building, as well as surrounding infrastructure such as a vacant lot, community park, or local business. So really, a resource hub is a resource center, and it's intended to be a staple of the community, something that people can relate to and understand is there to help you. And I guess what's unique about this process is because we actually implemented something called the co-design process. Now, kind of the difference there really involves the amount of engagement we do with the city. We could have had me as an engineer say the best place for this resilience hub is, at the corner of 2nd Street and 3rd Avenue, okay? But my opinion really doesn't relate to that of the greater community, right? People who will actually use that. I'm fortunate in Rochester. I have family that live there, a good support system. Not everyone has that. So this idea of co-design really comes in. So co-design is about challenging, or a quote here that really puts into perspective, co-design is about challenging the balance of power held within groups of individuals who make important decisions about others' lives, livelihoods, and bodies, often with little to no involvement of the people who will be most impacted by the decisions. Co-design seeks to change that through building new relationships, capability, and capacity for boundless curiosity. It uses inclusive convening to share knowledge and power. So I think that's a really good quote that really provides the essence of what the co-design process is. Furthermore, this slide really gets at barriers to participation, not precipitation. Community barriers, are power differentials in decision making, existing community networks, overvaluation of learned experience, and lack of lived experience to inform policy, program, and project design, as well as distrust of government institutions and public processes. All right, so those are barriers. Participation barriers of community members include lost wages, language barriers, meeting location, speak for community tokenism, transportation availability, childcare availability, and time of day. So this co-design process, actually through several of my colleagues, which include Lauren Jensen, the sustainability coordinator with City of Rochester, Sadie Newman, who's in the crowd right now, as well as Stephanie Hotzenbeeler, who is now a water coordinator with Stearns County, were instrumental in implementing all this. But in short, the co-design process involved reaching out to members of the community, actually recruiting members of the community who have who aren't typically heard from. So there's actually like an application process that went through. And with that, there was a series of meetings for which information was gained. Those people who were part of the co-design process, those community members, reached out to the people they're connected to gain information and bring that back. And at the end of the day, we not only wanted to know where to site this resilience hub, we also want to know what makes it important, what characteristics are important to the community. Now, we set off, if you recall, there were several tactics as part of that strategy, being, if I can remember right, social services, healthcare, and shelter. Those are big things, as well as means to address barriers like language, disabilities and things like that. But we also wanted to dig further. What was the vision of the community? And this slide that shows some of those aspects that were gained from that. So from service and programs, emergency preparedness, and community classes. So being informed about things that are unique to Rochester. Like a lot of people, Rochester is a very diverse community. So there's a lot of people from different areas that haven't experienced things like ice storms or hail or things like that. So they want to know. Communications, having people they can trust and know to be able to communicate these important issues. And then building landscapes, things that make the facility unique. So, I have 5 bullet points listed there. Those are all typically components of a resilience hub. We didn't really get into power and operations too much. So with that being said, we used a lot of information that was developed as part of our comprehensive surface water management plan that was presented to help inform this process. And we also included, other departments as well, or information from other departments as well. So we can see all those layers there that went into this. And ultimately, we definitely wrapped in kind of the biggest part of this, the flood risk assessment, and for use of the Shiny tool. And to cut to the chase, the facility that was ultimately selected, at least being a representative, something that would be, a good model for the Resilience Hub, is a place called Cascade Meadow. It's actually an extension of St. Mary's University in Rochester that's located within our priority sub-watershed, being Cascade Creek. So that's kind of a whirlwind, just touched on the highlights of that, the high points, but a lot went into it, and it was incredibly valuable getting those insights from, community members that aren't typically involved. So with that, we can field some questions if there's any time left. Thank you.
I think we're pretty pressed for time on this one, but I have one question, if you can answer it quickly, that I'm just, maybe it's just to elaborate a little bit on the project. You mentioned identifying the Cascade Creek watershed, and from reading through the deliverables, I know that you had identified this as a model watershed that you'll use. I wonder if you could just speak to that quickly so we can set the context for the project a little bit.
If you wouldn't mind, yeah.
So, is this on? Yeah. So the layers that Troy just showed on the second to last slide, I believe, where we had all the different layers about environmental resources in the city, infrastructural information, and environmental justice areas. We used that information in a series of meetings that were facilitated by Freshwater Community Resilience Building workshops that follows a framework developed by the Nature Conservancy. So we had conversations with various stakeholder groups, various people from the city, all those departments, to identify which drainage district in the city checked most of the boxes, right, for potential environmental impacts, potential impacts to infrastructure, and potential impacts to vulnerable communities. So that was a precursor step to the flood risk assessment.
Okay, and your model will be used in future assessments for other
Absolutely. Yes.
watersheds.
Thank you, Paula.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's give them a hand again. Okay, now we're going to have a little technology transition while I introduce our third presentation. Joining us from the city of Moorhead via remote, we have Andrea Crabtree. She is the utilities engineer for the city of Moorhead. She graduated from NDSU with a bachelor's in civil engineering. She has been with the city of Moorhead for 18 years and works in stormwater and floodplain management. Her duties include oversight of the city's MS4 program and the floodplain, the CFM program, the Certified Floodplain Management Program. And from Houston Engineering on the same project, we have Mike Love. He is a principal engineer at Houston and serves as their Fargo infrastructure sector lead. Mike is also an NDSU civil engineering grad. He is a licensed professional engineer in both Minnesota and North Dakota. and works as a project manager on a variety of engineering projects, including stormwater management, flood mitigation, land development, and other municipal infrastructure related projects. The project that they will be talking about is titled City of Moorhead Climate Change Resiliency Planning. And one thing about this project that I think is a little different, each project, hopefully you've noticed some differences in scopes. The St. Cloud project, I feel, maybe they had an area previously identified where they knew they could do some additional planning work. I think Rochester was starting with less of that background and doing some big picture planning. And I think Moorhead is kind of also in that, in maybe closer, they can clarify here, but I think they're a little closer to that initial planning stage. So I'm going to let them take it from here.
All right, so good morning, and thank you for joining us here today to talk about the City of Moorhead's Climate Change Resiliency Planning Study. Next slide, please. Our area of Minnesota is more known for the flooding of the Red River, not during the springtime events, but with this study, we will be talking about our other flood event, which is localized flooding due to heavy rainfall events. Prior to our grant application, we already had an existing comprehensive model of our storm sewer system developed for the City of Moorhead. We started gathering data information in around 2009 for our initial model, and the model has been updated as we've been going through different phases of software and different years of climate change. Some of the potential impacts we looked at with this study was street flooding, sanitary sewer overload and backup, and any property damage. Next slide. Can you hear me? Yeah. There you go. So our study area focuses more on the vintage infrastructure of the City of Moorhead. In these study areas, we have not upgraded the existing storm sewer system. So our goals in these two areas, we had broken down into a north area and a south area, and they also included the environmental justice areas. Our goals were to increase the resiliency to stormwater and reduce local flood risks. We wanted to improve the resiliency of our wastewater system, and we wanted to reduce human health effects and adapt community services, work on our ordinance and public spaces. Next slide, please. In order to engage the public, we did have a work task timeline that we set up. We wanted to collect any of new data for our modeling and update our model. Then we had a public meeting in the fall, engaged the public. We sent out postcards to about approximately 3,000 properties. We had about 8 citizens show up for our first public meeting. We also had available other options. Then after we did the data collection, had our first public meeting to see what the residents had to say, we drafted a risk assessment report, took that back for an additional public meeting. And at the end of June, we submitted our final risk assessment report for our areas. Next slide. Our outreach that we performed were postcards. Like I said, we sent out 3,000 postcards. We had a QR code on our postcard. We also had different languages to accommodate the non-English speaking residents and citizens. We also made available an online survey, and we sent postcards out for both public meetings. So approximately 6,000 postcards were sent out as part of this project. Next slide, please. We also set up a City of Moorhead website for our climate change resiliency study. We uploaded our presentation and our inundation maps for residents to be able to, and citizens to be able to go back and review what was done at the meetings. We also had an online survey available, and we created a GIS mapping tool that helped verify what residents were seeing out in the field compared to what we had on our model. And we also had available for anybody that did have questions to either call or email us. So we were available. Next slide, please. This was our online GIS mapping tool that we made available to residents. So they were able to click in this tool, add information, upload pictures. They could add the location of the catch basin by dropping in a little pin, adding in information like depth of rainfall event or depth that they saw in the street for flooding, where the flooding occurred, the date, upload pictures. So that was very helpful for us to verify against what we were seeing in our model, what the residents and citizens were seeing out in the field. Next slide, please. So this was the responses we got back from that online survey, or the online interactive GIS. You can see there where the dots are, those are within our north and south study areas. And 8 reports. They had an average flood depth of 7.8 inches. A lot of the flooding could have been done due to the plugged inlets. And so that's one thing we do see around here, and we try to advocate for residents and citizens to adopt a catch basin to try to keep our catch basins clean. So when we do have a heavy fall rain event, we can hopefully help prevent additional rise in the street. Next slide, please. So this is when our design events were when the city first designed the infrastructure in the north and south areas. It was based on the TP40 rainfall data. So, but our current infrastructure in the newer areas was designed based on the Atlas 14 data. Both of these data sources are based on past history. So now we need to look into the future and use the data to better prepare for climate change. So after considering several climate change projection sources, we selected the EPA National Stormwater Calculator, which projected a 15.8% increase in rainfall depth. So next slide, please. We focused the study on the higher probability storm events shown in the red. And then I'm going to turn over to Mike Love.
Okay. Next slide. Thanks, Andrea. Again, I'm Mike Love with Houston Engineering. I'm going to step through our impact assessment and risk assessment procedure. I know we're getting a little short on time, so I'll try to be a little bit quicker. So using, like Andrea mentioned, we were fortunate that the city had invested in a comprehensive InfoSwim model for the entire city. So we were able to start a little bit ahead of most people because we had all that model available and didn't have to create the model. We did do some updates to it, like Andrea had mentioned, and then our calibration. The model had previously been calibrated, but we more used the public input as a validation step to make sure that what the residents were seeing was what the model was showing. So the impact assessment framework focused on 4 major categories. So there were structure impacts, sanitary sewer impacts, transportation impacts, and then community spaces impacts. So each of those categories were assigned a score based on the inundation that was observed in each of the model catchments. And then that score was then weighted based on the type of impact. So for instance, if it was a structure impact, it received a higher 40% weighting. where if it was more green space or playground facility, it'd receive a lower weighting at 10%. Next slide, please. So each catchment, like I mentioned, was assigned a composite impact rating that was then mapped with a color gradient that's shown on the screen here. So like Andrea mentioned, there was 2 study areas. Just for simplicity, I'm going to just focus on this north area for demonstration purposes. But so the color gradient on here made it pretty easy to see like where our highest impact areas were within the city and the study area. Next slide, please. So we did this impact assessment for 3 different rain events, and these kind of correlate with those higher return period events that Andrea had mentioned. So we looked at a projected 2-inch, 3-inch, and 4-inch rain event, and then mapped the inundation and the impact rating for each of those events. So obviously, as you can see from left to right, as the rainfall increases, the inundation, which is shown in blue, increases, and then the risk rating goes up. So when I say projected 2, 3, and 4-inch, that means the future equivalent of a 2-inch rain today, assuming the climate change projections hold true. Next slide, please. So at that point, we had our impacts figured out. So similar to Rochester, you know, to get the risk, you need to factor in the probability of the event. So we took the probability of occurrence of the 2, 3, and 4-inch, multiplied it by the risk rating, or the impact rating, and came up with a risk rating. Next slide, please. So we then mapped the risk rating and kind of had a low to high gradient on it, so we could pretty easily see where the high risk areas were within the study area. Next slide, please. So because the 2-inch rain was such a high probability, it was like 92% probable. In most areas, that event is what drove the risk. Not all areas. So obviously, we compiled the risk of the impact times probability of all 3 events. Whichever one produced the highest rating in that catchment was what was mapped. So next slide, please. So using the risk assessment mapping, we then took it a step further and developed an improvement plan to try to mitigate some of the risks to those high risk and moderate risk areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just a zoomed in area, zoomed in view of one of the areas. So like on this plan, if you look kind of at the north or the top of the screen there. So we're proposing a stormwater pond, trunk line storm sewer infrastructure improvements. And we have an underground retention facility in an area. Really the tricky part here is in Moorhead, and since this is a established neighborhood with not a lot of open space, the opportunities for stormwater ponds is very limited. So the proposed improvements mainly consist of just putting larger storm sewer in to handle the increased rainfall. So on this map, you can see the areas that are shaded in red. Those are areas that would flood during a future event, but if we installed the improvements, they would no longer flood. Next slide, please. So once we developed the proposed improvements, we went through the whole process again. So we reanalyzed the 2, 3, and 4-inch events. We remapped the surface inundation. We recalculated the impact rating for each catchment, and then we recalculated the risk rating for each catchment, and then remapped that so we could see the improvements that the infrastructure improvements would create. Next slide, please. So this is just an example area. So on the left, you can see what the risk would be if we didn't do improvements. And then on the right, you can see if we install those improvements, the risk goes down quite a bit. Next slide, please. So next steps. So really the city is working to develop a phased improvement plan. to implement these in conjunction with their capital improvement projects. The improvements needed are pretty expensive. We have them estimated at about 120 million for both the north and south improvement areas. So funding opportunities are key. The city's really looking for any help they can get from the state. So once they secure some funding, then we'll look to develop plans and specs and implement the improvements. So next slide. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Thank you. Let's give them a hand.
And they were very efficient. It looks like we do have time for a few questions. Do we have one online in the chat? Let's start with one on the from the online chat.
It's a long one. It says, Andrea et al., but perhaps all the case studies could respond. Moorhead developed an GIS tool. Do you have a sense of how many members of the public, the citizens, the business owners, access these tools? Or do you think these tools are more often accessed and used by us, the professionals? I know many cities, watersheds, and industrial professionals develop and offer these. It would be nice to get a sense of their use.
So within the city of Moorhead, it is available for the public. It's there, it's on the website. We QR coded it on the postcard so that our citizens and our residents within those areas could respond on our GIS tool. We also have just our regular GIS tools available, which includes several different things, garbage pickup, parks, trails, all that kind of stuff on there too. But it would be, I want to say, as we keep going along, more people are using those tools that didn't in the past, but now are using them more.
Do you have the ability to track those hits on the GIS page apart from other hits on the city website, or?
Yes.
Or, okay. Just don't have that information off the top of your head. Did any of the other groups track that? Okay. So, we don't have a direct answer, but apparently it's something that maybe could be provided possibly through the Q&A. Thanks. All right. So we have a question from the audience. Looks like we have maybe time for one, and then we're going to take a break. Your name and affiliation?
I'm Sadie Newman. I'm with the city of Rochester. I'm wondering, so you use Survey 123 in order to collect that like localized data, and you got pictures and information from people who submitted it. I'm wondering if it's that comparison that you used to kind of validate the model that you already created. Were those differences where the observations didn't quite match what you expected? Is that kind of where the assumption that it was clogged inlets came from?
I can take that. So to answer that, we use that information as a validation check against the model. So for instance, if our model was showing, under all three of the events we looked at, we're showing flooding in this intersection, having that confirmation from the residents that yes, we have seen flooding in that intersection, and having pictures is very helpful because you can help gauge, approximate depth. But we both the city and Houston, following heavier rain events, we have been out observing the flooding and taking pictures, documenting intersections and things. And really that's when we've kind of noticed that, this inlet's got a lot of leaves on it or chaff on it, and it's likely the flooding in this intersection is caused by plugged inlet. So that's hopefully that answers your question. But
sorry, we have more time for questions at the moment. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Keep your questions at the back of your mind. You may be able to answer them during the panel discussion when we come back. Thanks. Great. Welcome back. We're ready to start our panel discussion portion of the seminar. Thank you for bearing with us. We've got some new technical challenges this time with our hybrid presentation format. And I want to thank the folks at SAFL, by the way, for taking time to set that up for us. A quick reminder, we've got from representing St. Cloud, Ian and Trent, representing the Rochester project, we've got Troy and Camilla, and via remote from Moorhead, we representing Moorhead, we have Andrea and Mike. I will kick this off with a question this about the grant in general. And this 2022 grant cycle was focused on towards planning for stormwater resiliency and community resiliency. So I'd like to start with the St. Cloud team, and we'll just kind of rotate through the teams. What do you think are the most important needs and interests of Minnesota communities in general, or in your part of the state when considering climate resilience planning?
So I think Trent hit on it just a second ago. I mean, one of the biggest things is, of course, going to be funding. And you can see some of what we were proposing. It has quite a high cost. But thinking about it a little bit more in advance of the seminar, one of the things that I was landing on is really, maybe would have to come from the state, but a determination on what the new recommended design storms are. I know that we at the city of St. Cloud lean quite heavily on what the state standards are for developing our local ordinances, and trying to have those discussions with developers on where are those new numbers coming from. Definitely would help having that from the state and more technical folks.
Thank you. Rochester, would you care to add some thoughts?
Sure, I can add a quick thought here. I think one of the things coming into our project was really kind of a quick analysis tool to understand what kind of potential there is for for issues created by storms that fall outside of what's normally considered, right? So with the help of UR, we developed to kind of to do just that, a quick filter. It was a flood hazard layer, which incorporated a lot of different, topography, different layers of information to kind of assess that, which proved to be very helpful to understand what kind of, potential there is for, catastrophic events based on the increased rainfall events.
Andrea and Mike, in your part of the state, what, when considering stormwater, what are the greatest needs and interests of your communities?
Ours would be infrastructure improvements, since we are so very flat here, that if the size of the capacity of our storm sewer system, if it can't handle a heavy rain event, it's going to flood the streets and possibly adjacent properties. So by hopefully having funding to increase our infrastructure size, we can help prevent property damages.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to go back through this group. I'm going to start in reverse and just quickly tag on, this RFP, the grant RFP, was really focused on flood mitigation and flood risk assessment, but that's not the only concern we have for stormwater. So other than the flood risk assessment, are there pieces that you feel are, you are concerned with for that are going to be impacted by climate resiliency regarding stormwater and future climate change? I'll start in reverse here. So let's go with Moorhead.
I'd say it's in Moorhead, there's a real concern when intersections flood. Pretty much every intersection has sanitary manholes in it, so you get impacts to your sanitary sewer system, which are pretty detrimental. So that's what I would think.
Okay. One thing that kind of gets, we're always talking about water quantity, but the water quality, and looking more holistically, looking at drought conditions and some of the where ponds fester and ultimately that water gets passed downstream, and that's a big responsibility for any MS4 and working towards their waste load allocations. So which is also affected by increased precipitation events. Well,
can I add one, Paula?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would just add that, we never got to the projects or the improvements that we were recommending, But from a stormwater management perspective, thinking about all of the hazards and all of the impacts, right? And looking for those projects that achieve more than just the stormwater management function, but looking for projects that have the most co-benefits. So thinking about tree canopy coverage and how we can address urban heat island impacts. So our solutions look both at underground storage, above ground storage, but relied a lot on green infrastructure, and then evaluated infrastructure upgrades as a last resort to alleviating flooding.
Thank you. St. Cloud, did you want to add anything on that? Your other stormwater concerns besides flooding that are rising to the top of your concern list because of climate change?
I would say one of them is looking at what the city can do to help kind of offset some of these development challenges, because instituting more stringent requirements kind of has the negative side of it, where kind of hamper development. So we want to be growing, and still we want to be growing, but doing it responsibly is a main concern for us, and doing it in a way that doesn't hamper that development.
Thank you. And just out of curiosity, I'm gonna add this one quick. Were any of you, I know these were largely built out areas in St. Cloud and definitely in Moorhead, maybe some pockets where it's not developed. Did anyone have to consider future development in their future scenarios? Did you have sub-watersheds that were not built out or will be developed?
We did not. Not that I can think of. We're mainly just looking at the development that was there. We were, as far as future goes, we were considering some land use changes for one of the large properties that Ian mentioned, potentially moving from a industrial land or an industrial land usage to a residential, and that kind of factored in with some of our proposed improvements, and possibly representing an opportunity to implement some storage and other BMPs to help alleviate our concerns.
Yeah, so for Rochester's comprehensive surface water management plan, we looked at an area that's to be developed, but runoff from this area would impact an area of the city that is developed but experiencing flooding. So there was a pretty tight rate control requirement on those upstream portions that are to be developed. And the city, within the last 20 years had envisioned a regional pond that could provide stormwater management when that development comes in. And we looked at a redesign or a reimagination of that regional pond and tried to come up with a system that we're calling integrated stormwater management that looks at the natural assets that are currently there, preserving those natural assets, building green infrastructure, and then again, sizing a pond at the bottom of the system that's smaller, but sized to accommodate what we project will happen in the future.
Moorhead, future development and climate change.
Yeah, so we specifically focused on these two areas because they were older areas of town that were built way back in the beginning and before the time when stormwater ponds were required. So there was really no retention in the system. Other areas of town that were built under newer standards have stormwater ponds. Those show a little better resiliency to climate change just because they have that built-in storage. So the study area that we looked at really didn't have any future development, and it was pretty much all built out.
I'm going to stop talking the questions for now. So let's, we've got one online raising their hand.
Yeah, we got a few here. The first is for all the panelists. The question is, please talk more about the funding of your projects. Short and sweet.
We haven't started with Rochester. Let's start there and we'll loop around.
Sure, I can start with that. So largely funding for our projects it's a product of our stormwater utility. That again is the source of that let's see, each year we embark on, or now it's every 2 years, embark on a capital improvement planning initiative where we plan out projects, and appropriate funding for that. Along with the city of Rochester is kind of unique in that it also has, I shouldn't say that with Moorhead and probably St. Cloud, there's a core flood control system that runs through that. But right now we have a proposed sales tax, to fund that as well. So that also could potentially be for larger regional projects, that, or for some of the tributaries to the South Fork Zumba River that come into town that now pose a greater threat than when the project was envisioned back in the 80s or 70s and 80s. So, but those are two primary sources there.
Did you say Moorhead? Did you say
I
Moorhead?
did.
Okay.
I did.
Sorry. Yeah, so we also have a utility fee that we use for various MS4 stuff, our infrastructure. So we are able to do some projects with our utility fee, and we're trying to incorporate our capital improvement plans with the need of what we have from this study, so we can try to piggyback projects on each other.
Yeah, and I'd probably just add, I mean, the city's trying to find outside funding sources because otherwise the burden falls on the residents, right? I mean, special assessments is basically the way you have to fund the funding gap. So.
St. Cloud?
I got it. So like the others, stormwater utility fee. We also mentioned the capital improvement projects, looking to pair them with capital improvement projects, so we aren't just trying to fund a standalone stormwater project. Ian touched on it in the presentation a little bit, looking for project partners too. So we're in the Sauk River Watershed District. With some of our projects involve or will require a partnership with MnDOT and Stearns County, and then anxiously awaiting the implementation grant program, which is hopefully rolling out soonish.
Great, thank you. I see we've got some audience questions, so we're going to go that route this time. Feel free to address your questions to one particular team or to all of them as appropriate, and do give us your name and affiliation.
Hey everyone, I'm Russ Bittner. I'm with the City of Edina. The one thing that surprised me on the presentations together were the focus on what is much smaller storms than we think about for our 100-year. And I saw a lot of street flooding, and the City of Edina has gone down this route. We're a 1950s and 60s era first ring suburb, and we're getting really comfortable with street flooding. The street flooding that has a nice overflow down to another street or a low area, we're good with. Talk to me why you're focusing on that, and then maybe I wanted to kind of emphasize something that I heard Mike say, which is the sanitary vector there, and getting the castings and the manholes all sorted out on the sanitary side, so you're not seeing backflow in the sanitary systems during small events. Might be a kind of a lead value point that you might be missing. And then how are you thinking about those larger events? How are you prioritizing against the ones that have a good overflow through the street, and then the ones that are at the low point that just have pipe out?
That was a mouthful. Anyone who wants to jump in, please do so.
I can take a shot at that. So in the city of Rochester, Ross, I would agree. We've become comfortable with that, but I'd say with that, it comes setting expectations for the public as well. That's something, through this surface water management plan exercise. We've also embarked on an asset management planning initiative. So again, that's a big part of it, setting those expectations. I think the thing, that really popped out with the analysis we discussed today with the flood risk assessment was the kind of the smaller events. And we do see in these, again, it's very different. There's some people that are very outspoken in communities, others that never say a word, but have obviously are being impacted. And I think those are the situations we are looking to address with those smaller events. Again, people that are actually suffering from shortfalls in infrastructure and whatnot. So.
I can piggyback on that. In Moorhead, I agree that if it's a residential intersection and it gets 6 inches of flooding, it's maybe not that big of a concern, right? It's a traffic nuisance. You got to drive through it. But the way Moorhead is so flat, I mean, we are so flat here that when that water starts to build up to 12, 18 inches, it starts lapping at people's houses, and it doesn't have an overflow. It doesn't have the ability to jump a high point and go to a new intersection or go to the river. So that's why the smaller events are pretty critical in Moorhead. And like you mentioned, pretty much every intersection has a sanitary manhole in it, and that is a very big concern to the city of Moorhead. So our proposed improvements are trying to mitigate that 2-inch, that really common 92% probability flooding in that intersection that's going to get in the sanitary system and start impacting houses.
Did you want to add, St. Cloud, or?
I would really just be piggybacking off of what Mike just said. We're very comfortable as well with water being in the streets. I know the city has identified areas where pooling frequently happens, and they place signages saying, water street floods during rain events, using an alternative route. And thankfully in St. Cloud, they've got enough of a grid system where that it's a possibility. But even in those areas, it's looking at them and saying this is going to be a priority and trying to find what the solution is going to be to keep those from flooding.
All right. Thank you. I know we had another audience question here, so I'm going to move on to that.
I'm Nigel Pickering. I'm with Geosyntec here in Minneapolis. My question was, how can we improve these analyses by adjusting the precipitation we're going to expect in the future with climate change? And I heard mention of Atlas 14, and that's good. That's a good first step, but it's a backward-looking analysis, so it's not even predicting today's values. I heard mention of global climate change model data from University of Minnesota, so I didn't hear the details, so I'll be interested in that. And then also we have on the East Coast this year, we had a number of hourly storms that far exceeded what you'd expect. In fact, it seems like the hourly values are changing faster than the daily values. So those are just some of my comments. I'd just like to hear the panel respond.
Again, anyone want to jump in first? Be brave. Okay, Camilla.
So what the data set that we used for future, or what we expect to happen in the future, was using the values that are in NOAA Atlas 14, but on the 90th percentile. And part of the decision for that was to keep it easy to explain to people, right? The more we say that we're using, globally downscaled or locally downscaled information, starts to become difficult for city council members or the public to understand. So sticking with the same validated data set seemed like a good decision until NOAA updates its rainfall data. Then we're just using that next version of what NOAA is making available, and that will account for non-stationarity. So we're eager to see that information. I'm trying to remember the second point that you made. Oh, we did also do an analysis where we looked at different distributions of the rainfall, sub-daily distributions, to see what the impact of that would be to the infrastructure. And we didn't, in our analysis, see a lot of difference. So we did account for that and picked what we thought was most representative.
So can we say, if anyone else wants to share their insights on the future storm distributions, depths, and other climate factors maybe that they used in planning the future scenario? Is that okay?
Yeah, so that actually was a challenge for our project, because I mentioned we used the U of M data, but interestingly, when we looked at the small events, so we were mainly looking for our analysis at the 10-year event, and when we looked at the 10-year event for the U of M data for our project area, it actually showed a lower rainfall total than the Atlas 14. So we didn't feel that was useful to model a lower event than what Atlas 14 already says. So we ended up kind of averaging the larger storm increases and averaging the increases from I think it's called the EPA's model. I think it's called CREATE or something like that. We then just kind of, after we did that averaging, we applied that for our projected condition changes. But I think it just comes down to including that factor of safety and just not being complacent with just the Atlas 14 data and just bump it up some for factor of safety. I mean, until there's more definite data out there, that's really, I don't want to say all we can do, but we felt better about that.
Moorhead, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just say when we ran our analysis, we used the projections from the EPA stormwater calculator, which I believe the back end of that is that CREATE data as well. So we applied basically almost a 16% increase in the rainfall depths to account for the future climate change. And when we developed our proposed improvements, we made sure that they address that increased rainfall amount as well.
Did that get to your question, or was there a part that? Okay. Okay, having a safety factor is a good idea. We're going to take an online question. And so please share.
Okay, this is thanks for the comment that Rochester looks first at natural-based solutions before looking at infrastructure. One thing I don't often hear, and it would be hugely controversial, but what about reclaiming wetlands and floodplains?
That for the city of Rochester? Well, we'll start there and then see if anybody wants to.
I can attempt to. So Rochester is in kind of a, it's a unique position in that so much of the major stream corridors are actually part of the flood control system. So to do so, I shouldn't say there's not a way to do that, but it's not a straightforward way. And then another thing would be if there'd be any, political will to do such a thing as well. But definitely, I think, looking back on how things were done and how we'd like to see things, moving forward, we definitely want to start with the kind of natural-based solutions and work back to gray infrastructure. So I think that's always in mind. I know there are some initiatives with the Destination Medical Center to start augmenting some of that. So maybe that'll spark some, some momentum for that type of conversion.
Can I just add to that, Paula? Because that reimagination of that regional pond that I talked to. So the city of Rochester is including in the comprehensive surface water management plan protections for those tributaries that are coming into the existing floodplain. So what is the floodplain going beyond the main branches, and then figuring out how we can integrate those environmental corridors or those tributaries so that the floodplain for those systems are managed and operating as part of the stormwater management system.
Okay, and maybe for the Moorhead and St. Cloud folks, we need to just reframe the question a little bit so that you're thinking about your full MS4 jurisdiction, because your projects were focused a little on more specifically. So can you just restate the question again, and we'll just put that in the context of your jurisdiction?
Okay, so it says, I'll do half of it. One thing I don't often hear and would be hugely controversial, but what about reclaiming wetlands and floodplains?
Okay, St. Cloud, you got any? Oh, it looks like Moorhead is raising their hand. So I know they have a lot to say about flooding. Please proceed.
So our issue with this study was away from the river and outside of the floodplain. But with the floodplain itself, we have acquired a lot of property, and part of our flood mitigation projects, we also have native plantings that we've placed back along the river. in a lot of our floodplain areas. So we have regained floodplain space, but for our infrastructure, it actually doesn't tie into the river as the issue, because our river is pretty slow moving, doesn't become a rapid river during a rain event, like some areas like up in Duluth with their topography, how the falls become very rapid very quickly. Our area is pretty flat, so our river does not become a rapid river. So I don't know if that helps answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add, St. Clair?
Sure. Yeah. So as far as reclaiming, I don't have much to add other than I mean, you nailed it on the head with the keyword controversial, and that's a tough one. But as far as looking at new developments within the city, we are considering that. We're actually working on a current MPCA project, the same grant program for our South St. Cloud area, in which the city has recently instituted a new rate control standard that takes into account environmentally sensitive areas and requires a reduced rate control standard versus just the normal. You must meet the existing, the 100 must meet the, existing 100 must meet the proposed 100. Where the challenge comes in is we're running into challenges with that, I'll just say, and something that we're working through as we work through this current grant project.
Yeah, and I know South St. Cloud is kind of a whole, just mostly wetland, maybe.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. I'll go, thank you. Yeah, thank you all. And I'll go to another audience question. And once again, John Gulliver had his hand raised, so we better go there.
Thank you. I'm John Gulliver from University of Minnesota, St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. Okay, I understand why you're all dealing with the 10-year flood. But if I buy a house, I don't want to know anything about the 10-year flood. I'm more interested in the 100-year flood, right? And the 100-year flood is more difficult to model because you don't have data typically. So I'm wondering what you have all done with the 100-year flood. And I have a specific question for Rochester, and that is, did the order of your sub-watershed susceptibility or resilience criteria change when you moved from the 10-year flood to a 100-year flood? And what was the impact of that? And then my other question I'd like to spread to everybody: 100-year flood versus 10-year flood.
I don't have a good answer at this point.
I have a couple.
Okay, yeah, you go.
Yeah, so when we went through the risk assessment and ranked those, using those three lenses, we didn't see a lot of change in how those subcatchments were prioritized. So I will say, Dr. Gulliver, so when we looked at that, we wanted to elicit that information, those priorities based on those smaller events. But again, the 100 years of regulatory event, so that is one that we still that still takes a priority amongst all this, right? To protect structures and whatnot to that level. What we're trying to get at is kind of to not, I guess, I don't know if it's intuitive, but protecting most things to the 100-year level, sometimes we'll forget some of those smaller, more localized things. And that's really what we're trying to elicit from that analysis, kind of where those things, does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So again, the 100 years definitely a priority, one that we, that's the city's obligated to protect, structures to that kind of thing. But again, looking a little further into it, that's where we started looking at some of these more frequent events.
I got two parts to that, I guess. So first, regarding the modeling the 10 versus the 100, in our case, we modeled the 10 more so out of practicality, just because even with our nuclear option, where we replace the entire trunk line for the entire length of it, we couldn't completely eliminate flooding for the 10-year event. So it kind of came down to we had to settle for improving things as best as we can, and had to focus on the smaller storms before, or shouldn't say we had to, but we focused on the smaller storms first. The second part, though, is that I'll say that this project isn't over. We were very intentional with kind of setting up this model so that it's a living model. And as we keep adding to it and changing the model and implementing projects, I see us coming back and looking at those larger events and giving those more consideration.
Moorhead, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I can just say that we have modeled the 100-year rain event throughout the entire city of Moorhead, and mainly in the areas that were built in more recent times that have stormwater ponds and have a standard for how high above the curb your basement should be. Those tend to fare a lot better just because of those new standards that are in place. So another reason why we focused on the areas that we did was because those don't have those, they were built before those standards were established, right? So the basement elevations are a lot lower, they're a lot closer to the curb, they're a lot more susceptible to street flooding. And, really it comes down to biting off more than you can chew, right? like I mentioned, yeah, you can try to do improvements to keep the streets from flooding during 100-year, but I mean, we're at $120 million just to try to solve a 10-year event. So it's got to be manageable. I mean, basically is what it comes down to.
Thank you. I'm going to close out with one final question. If some of our panelists are able to stick around after and audience members, we'll take a few more questions, but I want to make sure we get this one in, which is just please share with us one of your lessons learned from this project or this process. And we'll just go down the line, starting with Ian, and you can all give us your key takeaways.
Yeah, I think from the municipality perspective, in terms of these planning grants, I would just say keep an open mind onto what your consultants come up with as the causes and solutions. I know came into this thinking it would be one set of things primarily causing the flooding, and kind of went in a bunch of different directions.
I would say prioritization is key. Just kind of going through this project and seeing how we, coming into the project, we had an idea of, okay, we'll probably model about 5 different proposed alternatives, and quickly ran the list up to over 14 proposed alternatives, and they were all good ones. So we didn't want to cut them out. So just having a method to prioritize your projects and implement the most cost-effective ones, that's really important.
Yeah, and from my perspective, it's really fundamental. It's just what we witnessed just as we went through the risk assessment is really just the availability of good data. I mean, that really informs all of this. And I mean, we knew going into it, we had some shortfalls. We really know what our shortfalls are now and where we can improve, as we advance through the rest of our planning process.
Just stole my.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I got to it first. There's many more.
I think just starting the conversation, I think, we were very fortunate to be able to work for the city of Rochester because Troy has a great vision for what he wants to do and understands all these concepts well. So when I think about other communities that aren't as knowledgeable on the subject, I think just starting the conversation, which rainfall events to use, right? It's really hard to talk about uncertainty and how that impacts so many different aspects of what a city has to manage and plan for. So just starting to talk about it. That's what Catherine Hayhoe says, right? Just start talking to your neighbors and the people in your community about climate change impacts.
Okay, Mike and Andrea?
I would say our lessons learned were that we already had in place with our GIS system good data on our storm and sanitary system. So having that good data is very key. So if you are a community out there that doesn't have the data, I would say start inventorying your system for when you are ready for a model. You have that information ready for them. And then also what we learned is that what we've been seeing out there was also confirmed within our model. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew stole a lot of my thunder too. So
sorry.
But I guess what was maybe the most benefit of the analysis that we did was, you know, like I mentioned, we've done a lot of modeling in Moorhead. We know there's issues. What this study really allowed us to do was really hone in on those really high risk areas and focus the improvements so we could be the most cost effective with our solutions.
Okay, thank you. Let's have another round of applause for our presenters. And thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andy.
Very good. I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series event. I hope you'll join us for a future one coming up next month. We're actually going to be talking about harnessing the power of stormwater data to make better management decisions. So that's going to be an interesting topic as well. Before we close, I want to thank obviously Linnea and Paula for working so hard to get this organized and put together. I want to thank our panelists and presenters for presenting these case studies. I want to thank the audience for joining us today, both in person and online, and for your patience as we work through hybrid situation. And I hope that you'll join us for a future Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. Thank you so much. Have a good day.